Bueno, muy buenas tardes, queridos amigos, queridas amigas. Muchas gracias por vuestra presencia esta tarde-noche en el Observatorio de la Lengua Española y las Culturas Hispánicas en los Estados Unidos, del Instituto Cervantes, en Harvard University. Tenemos un nombre muy largo. Let me switch now from this undocumented language to the new official language of the nation so we don't get in trouble. Today we're here to listen to Professor Bécquer Seguín, who will surely mention literary masters like Manuel Vázquez Montalbán, Paco Umbral, Rosa Montero, Muñoz Molina, Javier Marías, Javier Cercas, or Almudena Grandes. Apart from being son of Spain's greatest novelist, what they have all in common is that they wrote for the opinion section of El País, the newspaper. But Professor Seguín isn't here to speak about the obvious. Instead, he will be speaking about something much less evident, more subtle. How Juan Luis Cebrián's Tribuna Libre, El País former opinion section, was actually modeled after the op-ed pages of the New York Times. So let me introduce you now to Professor Bécquer Seguín. He's an assistant professor of Iberian Studies at Johns Hopkins University, and he's the author of the volume, The Op-Ed Novel, A Literary History of Post-Franco Spain, published in 2024 by Harvard University Press. His research focuses on the literary and intellectual history of modern Spain, and he has appeared in journals such as Critical Inquiry and Hispanic Review. He has covered Spanish politics and culture for The Nation since 2015, and he regularly writes for media in the US and Spain, including El País, of course, Slate, CTXT o CTXT, I think is short for Contexto. He also writes for Los Angeles Review of Books and for Public Books, where he co-edits the Literature in Translation and Sports sections. I'm coming back to be linguistically undocumented. Me paso de nuevo al español. Y querido Bécquer, estimado profesor Seguín, muchas gracias por regalarnos tus ideas y tus análisis sobre estas influencias transatlánticas en la prensa literaria española de la transición y de la post-transición, si es que eso existe. Professor Seguín, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you. And thank you to Javier. Thank you to everyone here at the Instituto Cervantes. Thank you to the previous director, Marta. And thank you all for joining me today. So the title of my talk is, let's say, maybe a slightly misleading, but hopefully I'll take a circuitous route to answer the question implicitly stated in the title. So first I want you to imagine the following. When you open the print edition of El País, Spain's paper of record, you will need to leaf through a dozen or so pages to get to the opinion section. You know you've arrived once the certainty of bold-faced headlines gives way to the more subtle italic tilt. Images are another giveaway. Photographs are replaced by illustrations. Many are drawn by one man, the country's most famous political cartoonist, Peridis, whose uncluttered pen-on-paper drawings have, since 1976, routinely skewered the country's political elite in 4 panels or less. At the bottom of the page, you'll find the ubiquitous El País logo, acting as an official stamp of approval for the editorial immediately placed above it. But one turn of the page too many might land you in the national section, or España. And one turn of the page too few might land you in the international section. At 4 pages in length, opinion is one of the shortest sections of the paper. On a typical day, it might feature an editorial or two, 4 or 5 letters to the editor, a syndicated op-ed from an international columnist, and 4 or 5 other op-eds from the paper's healthy stable of opinion writers. Yet one thing stands out above the rest. Novelists are everywhere in the opinion pages of El País. Of the 75 regular opinion writers listed by the newspaper, 1/3 are professional novelists. Many of these writers, from Enrique Vilamatas to Nahat El-Hachmi, are not just regular contributors, but in fact are weekly columnists. Such significant literary representation in the opinion pages of a major global newspaper is uncommon. At the New York Times, for instance, the number of regular opinion writers who are also novelists is 1 in 7. Think, for example, of Sheila Heti or Viet Thanh Nguyen. At Le Monde, that number is roughly 1 in 10. Think of Leila Slimani. The numbers are similar, if perhaps lower, at other global newspapers, from The Guardian in the UK to the Frankfurter Allgemeine Zeitung in Germany. What's more, these papers have rarely have their own Vilamatases or Hachmis. That is, novelists who are not just regular, but in fact are weekly columnists. If, quote, opinion writing tends to reflect the true disposition of a newspaper, as the language columnist for El País, Alex Grigelmo, has written, the disposition of El País has from its inception been willfully literary. This begs the question, why does Spain's most important newspaper employ so many novelists as opinion columnists? The answer both is and is not the New York Times. The Times, alas, does not have a distinguished track record of publishing opinion by novelists. In fact, the last columnist who wrote novels, Anna Quindlen, won the Pulitzer Prize for Commentary in 1992. 2 years later, she left the paper to dedicate herself exclusively to writing fiction. That was more than 30 years ago. Yet the Times is the reason why El País has an opinion section to begin with. Before 1976, no newspaper in Spain had a modern opinion section. If they published opinion at all during the years of the Franco dictatorship, such articles were strewn across different sections of the paper. Without the Times, opinion journalism in Spain would look like a time capsule from the early 20th century, at a time when, as the writer and journalist Manuel Chávez Nogales writes, quote, the classical columnist is he who every morning stands on his soapbox and speechifies at his own whim, pulling articles out of his head on all that is divine or human, end quote. Let's go back to that number. 1/3 of regular opinion writers at Spain's most important newspaper are novelists. In this talk, I want to tell the story of this remarkable statistic. It is a number that is held relatively stable since the founding of El País in 1976, when more than 1/5 of opinion pieces were written by literary writers, almost all of whom were novelists. In order to tell this story, I want to attempt to answer a series of questions. How did this happen? In other words, how did it come to be, that in Spain literary writers became so prevalent among opinion writers? And also, what does this phenomenon reveal about Spain's newspapers, about its novelists, or about its public sphere? So to tell this story, allow me to introduce you to Juan Luis Cebrián. Cebrián was the founding editor-in-chief of El País. From his first days as editor, before the first issue of the paper had even appeared, he wore his ambition on his sleeve. As he wrote in his 1980 book, The Press and Main Street, he wanted El País to become nothing less than Spain's de facto public sphere. Quote, from my point of view, the absence of a real public opinion in our country weakens the claim of representation made by our democratic administration, end quote. At El País, the editorial pages in particular would be tasked with generating this real public opinion. And to do so, they would take inspiration from the editorial pages of 2 newspapers in particular. One, the New York Times, obviously, and also Le Monde. Le Monde provided them with the name for what they were to call the op-ed, the tribuna libre, right, or in French, tribune libre, or open platform, I guess is the general translation that I've come up with. The Times provided them with their ideal form, an avenue for people from outside the paper to contribute articles on current affairs that didn't necessarily represent the paper's own views. Quote, "The Tribuna Libre of El País," Cebrián wrote in the paper's inaugural opinion column on May 4th, 1976, "will be open to all the people and ideologies that want to express themselves in its pages, with the only condition being that arguments, questionable as they may be, will be respectful of their adversary and support solutions for coexistence among Spaniards," end quote. The op-ed form was not the only thing that Cebrián borrowed from the Times. He also borrowed its ideals. Couched in civil discourse, Cebrián's open call for opinions mirrored what the founder of the Times op-ed page, John B. Oakes, had written several years earlier. In 1970, Oakes wrote in his own inaugural announcement of the Times op-ed page, quote, "The health of American democracy has increasingly depended on deeper public understanding of difficult issues," end quote. To foster that understanding, op-ed contributors would be, quote, "writing on the widest possible range of subject matter and expressing the widest possible variety of opinion." The goal, he concluded, again, this is Oakes, was, quote, "to create an intellectual forum from which, to paraphrase Terence, nothing will be foreign that relates to man and his society," end quote. The grandiosity of these ideals, however, didn't necessarily translate to El País's readership. The newspaper quickly came to define its target audience rather narrowly. Instead of bringing a new reader into being, the young publication, one of two major newspapers launched in 1976, was most interested in a public that already existed. Less than 5 years in, El País had amassed an outsized influence on Spanish politics. As Cebrián explained, quote, "It is not easy to understand how newspapers with low circulation and even lower readership, estimated at 20 to 25% of all voters, can be so powerful." He continued, "This makes more sense once one accepts the notion that elites and opinion leaders influence voter decisions or politicians' judgments almost solely on the basis of newspaper articles." In his inaugural opinion column, Cebrián used the word convivencia to describe the kind of op-ed page he wanted to create. Convivencia, or coexistence, was a loaded term in Spain. In the post-war period, the term was popularized by the renowned philologist Américo Castro, who used it to argue that the Spanish people were not a pure biological race, but rather the product of centuries of coexistence between Muslims, Jews, and Christians in the medieval Iberian Peninsula. During the country's transition to democracy, convivencia resurfaced in popular usage as a way to delegitimize the single-party, single-ideology system Francoism had imposed upon Spain over the previous 4 decades. Context was important. Many at the time, especially on the left, feared another right-wing coup, fears that would be realized just a few years later in 1981 with Antonio Tejero's failed coup attempt. So talking about convivencia was one way to stave off this threat, even if rhetorically. A miniature public sphere based on convivencia, Cebrián thought, might broaden the spectrum of legitimate political opinion in Spain. But as he well knew, it was also a shrewd business move. As the New York Times discovered shortly after the launch of its own op-ed page in 1970, the continuous stoking of controversy was a good way to keep drawing readers back to newsstands. During the late 1970s, a cacophony of elite voices from 3 broad groups competed for spots in the paper's opinion pages. The largest of these groups was the pro-reform yet conservative bourgeoisie. Next came the reform ambivalent parts of the Francoist economic, cultural, and political establishment. Finally, the smallest of these groups consisted of center-left intellectuals, or left-of-center intellectuals. Though it might seem surprising to us today, for anyone who has read El País in the past 30 years, it was by no means preordained that over the course of its first decade in existence, the opinion section of El País would drift steadily toward this last group, right, the center-left group. As one scholar put it, the opinion section, quote, had the wherewithal to turn itself into the interpreter of the aspirations of the most dynamic sector of the ruling class, end quote. One can glimpse the tensions between these competing groups in that first issue on May 4th, 1976. Alongside Cebrián's inaugural column, two op-eds appeared. The first was an homage to the Spanish poet León Felipe, written by another Spanish poet, Rafael Alberti. The second was a piece by the historian and Francoist insider Ricardo de la Cierva calling for the Francoist administration to continue its moderate transition to democracy rather than give in to its authoritarian inclinations. Each piece was directed at a specific subsection of elite readers. While Alberti's contribution was aimed at the left-of-center world, right, yearning for the return of exiles, de la Cierva's piece spoke to moderates in and around the corridors of power. Yet neither group of elite readers at this point really had much to do with one another. Published in the same newspaper, on the same page, on the same day, these columns evinced the underlying logic of the early El País opinion section. Freedom of speech meant playing to one's base. Cross-ideological dialogue was a remote fantasy. Cebrián's thin conception of press freedom amounted to little more than differing opinions speaking past one another. Convivencia, in other words, meant tolerance and equality, not harmony and understanding. As the media historian Michael Sokolow argues, to function, quote, as a unitary, inclusive, and diverse public sphere, an opinion page necessarily obscures the more contentious reality of negotiation amongst multiple publics in any given society, end quote. The early El País, for better or worse, wore the negotiation of this contentious reality on its sleeve. By the time Cebrián had published his announcement for the Tribuna Libre, the op-ed genre, as a genre of opinion journalism, was only just becoming a recognizable feature of newspapers. During the late 1950s, in response to what was largely recognized as a quote-unquote moment of crisis of confidence in the media, the New York Times turned its attention to its editorial pages. At the time, the newspaper ran editorials on one page and letters to the editor on the other page. One account suggests that the idea for the op-ed dates to 1958, when then staff editor John B. Oakes, here on your right, received several letters that were too long to be published as letters to the editor, but were not long enough to be published in the New York Times weekend magazine. In 1961, Oakes was appointed the editorial page editor. He began occasionally commissioning such pieces, such opinion pieces, including ones that might directly challenge the arguments that the editorial writers advance in their editorials. He published these opinion pieces on the opposite page from the editorials, right above the letters to the editor. When Arthur Sulzberger was appointed the paper's publisher in 1963, here pictured on your on your left, Oakes attempted to formalize this idea of commissioning opinion pieces by outside contributors, right? And that's the key thing about op-eds. They're outside contributors. It would take another 7 years for this new feature to come into existence. He would eventually call this new feature the op-ed page, short for opposite the editorial page. On September 21st, 1970, the idea for what Oakes once called an independent forum for the rational exchange of views finally materialized. Quote, The purpose of the op-ed page is neither to reinforce nor to counterbalance the Times' own editorial position, wrote the editors in this short announcement. The objective, rather, is to afford greater opportunity for the exploration of issues and presentation of new insights and new ideas by writers and thinkers who have no institutional connection to the Times, and whose views will very frequently be completely divergent from our own. Oakes envisioned this new section as capturing, quote, the whole broad range of opinion, the conflict of ideas that was taking place in a society at any given moment. The ideal of using the opinion pages of newspapers as a miniature public sphere quickly caught on across the world. In its first years, the Times op-ed page became the most read section of the newspaper. In fact, it in part helped keep the newspaper economically afloat during the financial turmoil of the early 1970s. Readers sought out controversy, and the opinion page regularly manufactured it. As Sokolow, the media historian, argues, the op-ed page, quote, effectively wedded the philosophical notion of the public sphere and the practical reality of a newspaper needing to be profitable, end quote. Over the course of the 1970s and 80s, many new newspapers across the world would come to embrace the form. Cebrián fully embraced this vision, this very particular vision of American liberalism as translated through its newspapers. That is, a public sphere in which ideas could be sharpened through debate, but that would also be profitable. In the words of a longtime Times journalist, quote, in the voice of the columnists, one could hear, if at times discordantly, the joyful noise of a free people. As Oakes had said at the time of the launch of the Times op-ed page, quote, diversity of opinion is the lifeblood of democracy. Again, these are the ideals, right, of American liberalism that are baked into the Times op-ed page. Quote, another quote, the minute we begin to insist that everyone think the same way we think, our democratic way of life is in danger, right? We think as in the editorial board, right? The editorial, which at that point was the dominant form of opinion writing. These ideals played an important role among El País's first generation of writers and editors. Juan Cruz, a first-generation El País journalist, later recalled how the newspaper was, quote, obsessed with publishing articles from all the possible sectors in order to start a controversy or reach across the aisle, end quote. The paper, he continued, commissioned opinion pieces from what it considered to be, quote, the most diverse characters of public life or Spanish or foreign culture, end quote. As such, it developed an image, according to another early observer, as, quote, a public space in which social exchange is articulated and collective identity is projected, a true forum illustrated by the opinion pages of El País, end quote. Given the history that I've recounted so far, as well as the longer history that I tell in the book, the extent to which these ideals were actually put into practice is debatable. What is undeniable, however, is the fact that their circulation among El País staff in these early years left a lasting impact on the institutional memory of the paper itself. Even as El País borrowed liberally from American newspapers, the early op-ed page contrasted rather dramatically with some of its American counterparts. As the journalist Jonathan Blitzer has argued, quote, unlike the op-ed pages of the New York Times or the Washington Post, where politicians often go to make their programs sound palatable, the opinion pages of the young El País were more akin to an evolving think tank, whose participants were in large part the decision makers, end quote. According to Blitzer, a 1995 poll of Spanish public opinion showed that, quote, 82% of Spaniards felt that the press had played the largest role in democratization, more significant than that of any political figure except Adolfo Suárez, the first democratically elected prime minister to succeed the late dictator, end quote. It has even been suggested that politicians at the time took their policy platforms directly from the El País op-ed page. If true, this would not be much of a surprise. During the early years of El País, as Cebrián described in his 2016 memoir, he and other figures at the paper partook directly in the ongoing backdoor conversations among the country's politicians, corporate elites, and the monarchy. But how did all of this manifest in the paper itself? In 1986, scholars Gerard Imbert and José Vidal Benito published one of the first comprehensive sociological studies of El País. Some of their findings were revelatory. In a sample of opinion columns published between September and October 1980, Imbert and Vidal Benito found that El País had published 32 different authors, most of whom were over 55 years old and belonged to the political right. This profile was in many respects the demographic opposite of its paper's readership, which was primarily under 45 and identified with the political left. As the two scholars wrote, quote, "This analysis reflects rather well the impact of certain ideological forces on the editorial line of the paper. The opinion section, as outlined in the study, is either very revealing of the true public and ideological nature of the paper, or plays a role that has nothing to do with the paper's journalistic purpose," end quote. They left it up to readers to decide which of these exactly was being revealed. Literary figures, I'm going to get back to literature now. Literary figures were central to the opinion pages of El País. And here you have Cebrián and Gabo. Imbert and Vidal Benito made much of this phenomenon in their sociological study. Of the 32 contributors to the opinion pages over those 2 months in 1980, 7 counted as literary writers: Juan Benet, José Antonio Gabriel y Galán, Juan Goytisolo, Octavio Paz, Rafael Sánchez Ferlosio, José Ángel Valente, and Gabriel García Márquez. Most of these writers were major figures in Spanish-language fiction, and their inclusion in the opinion pages immediately gave the paper an unparalleled literary and cultural prestige. But women were nowhere to be found. All 32 contributors over this 2-month span in 1980 were men. This complete exclusion of women from the opinion pages was typical of the newspaper in its early years. So much so, in fact, that the only woman to write a regular opinion column for El País during its first decade in existence was Rosa Montero, here pictured to your right. Her column, which launched in 1978, appeared not in the daily opinion section, however. This is key, but in the Sunday magazine El País Semanal. Second only to Montero was Maruja Torres, another towering figure of opinion writing at the paper, or someone who eventually became a towering figure of opinion writing. Both women who had started their careers as journalists, as reporters, would soon also become well-known novelists. Apart from Montero and Torres, however, only a few female bylines appeared in the opinion section with any regularity during the 1980s. The most notable of these was that of the exiled Uruguayan writer Cristina Perillo Rossi, herself one of the most important Latin American literary intellectuals of the past half-century. By 2001, fast forward 20 years, the number of women to have a column in the opinion section of the newspaper had increased to 5. Such dismal gender parity, however, was not unique to El País. A study of the country's 7 major national newspapers by the scholar María Jesús Casals found that from 2000 to 2001, only 21 of the 199 columnists, or 10.5%, were women. These female columnists, moreover, contributed a mere 6% of the total output by regular columnists. The divergence between these two figures, 10.5% and 6%, both of which are extremely low, is explained by the fact that while nearly 36 men published an average of nearly 2 columns per week, the only woman to reach the same average was Carmen Rigalt of El Mundo. But one other finding in her study also stood out. Quote, "It is noteworthy," Casals writes, "that the three Madrid newspapers, ABC, El Mundo, and El País, were those that had the lowest representation of female op-ed writers in their pages," end quote. By the time Montero and Torres began working for El País in the late 1970s, journalism and literature in Spain had been separated for decades. During the dictatorship, literary writing continued to flourish, however, in a complicated manner, right? Thanks to a heavy reliance on metaphor, insinuation, and foreign publishing houses. Journalism, by contrast, suffered a far bleaker fate. In regions across Spain, reporting was tightly controlled from the very first months of the Civil War. Following the end of the war, the new authoritarian state would subsequently place the press under the control of its interior ministry, which appointed newspaper editors, credentialed journalists, and set national propaganda policy. In 1966, after nearly three decades of strict control, the Franco regime liberalized part of that censorship apparatus with the passage of what is commonly known as the Ley Fraga or Fraga law, named after the Information and Tourism Minister Manuel Fraga Iribarne. The new law abolished preventive censorship, meaning that publishers were no longer required to submit materials in advance of publication to be approved by censors. But it retained political, religious, sexual, and linguistic restrictions, placing the burden directly on newspaper editors and book publishers to adhere to these strict restrictions or else risk sanctions and criminal prosecution. The regime's bait and switch on censorship meant that significant changes to journalism would not truly arrive until the restoration of democracy in the late 1970s. Shedding 4 decades of restrictions on publishing, Spain's transition to democracy breathed new life into both journalism and literature. But importantly, it brought these two disparate forms of writing together again. The proliferation of newspapers and magazines, as well as the democratic revitalization of old ones, created a vacuum of column space that suddenly needed to be filled. A young generation of journalists would come to fill most of that column space with various kinds of reporting, right? Most of the newspaper is kind of news reporting journalism. From news, right, to economics, to culture, and science. But a sizable chunk of that column space would be reserved for opinion writing. And to fill that column space, editors of the newly legalized free press predictably turned to politicians and other journalists, but they also turned to literary writers, and novelists in particular. Literary writers, the idea went, might more accurately represent the country's newfound cultural and political pluralism. If these were some of the historical reasons why novelists began populating Spain's opinion pages in the late 1970s, there were also aesthetic ones. During the last years of the Franco dictatorship, a new generation of journalists began cultivating a form of opinion-oriented reporting that went by the name of periodismo informativo de creación, or literary news journalism. Following the de facto lifting of press restrictions in 1975, the newspaper opinion sections would become a laboratory for this new form of experimental opinion writing. It was a form that combined news, opinion, and literary style. At the same time, this new form legitimated and created a readerly appetite for literature-inflected opinion writing. This new generation of young journalists who developed this form included, for example, Manuel Vázquez Montalbán, Francisco Umbral, and of course, Rosa Montero and Maruja Torres, all of whom would go on to become some of the most influential voices in post-Franco opinion journalism. Not surprisingly, these same columnists would also become celebrated novelists. In a matter of decades, the trail that they blazed would become evident. Casals' 2004 study of the opinion pages, the sociological study, found that literary writers were second only to journalists in the number of columns they wrote. In fact, 16% of all weekly columnists from across Spain were literary writers, which was more than politicians and university professors combined. So, what exactly does this phenomenon of the literary op-ed writer reveal? I think it reveals a number, I want to claim it reveals a number of things about Spanish newspapers. It reveals the close relationship between El País and Spain's politicians during the late 1970s and 1980s. It reveals the economic incentive to publish entertaining debates in the op-ed pages, which literary writers were qualified to do. And it reveals the abundant institutional sexism female opinion journalists faced, and in many ways continue to face, across the Spanish media. About Spanish novelists themselves, it reveals how some of them got their start as journalists, and how others used journalism to preserve a certain intellectual status in Spanish society. And about Spain's public sphere, what does it reveal? It reveals just how central literary writers are not only to culture, but also to intellectual and political life. But one question about the history of opinion journalism remains. Where are we now?
Gracias. Este es el sitio que más me gusta de todo el periódico. A mí me encanta, como el corazón y las arterias. Si esto no funciona, el país no funciona. Incluso funcionando tampoco...
Perdón.
¿Sí?
Ángel.
Sí, soy yo. Hasta luego. Hasta luego.
Soy Leo.
¿Qué Leo?
Leo Macías, la amiga de Betty.
Ah, sí. Betty me llamó para decirme que vendría. ¿En qué puedo ayudarme?
Pues la verdad es un atrevimiento por mi parte, pero me gustaría escribir para su periódico sobre literatura. Ya le advertí que sería un atrevimiento.
Un poco de atrevimiento le vendrá bien al suplemento. Estoy tratando de aligerarlo un poco. A propósito, no sé si he leído algo suyo.
No, no he leído nada.
¿Cómo lo sabe? Tengo cara de inculto.
No, es que no he publicado nada. Por supuesto no pretendo que me dé trabajo solo por ser amiga de Beatriz. Le he traído algunas cosas para que se haga una idea de cómo escribo. Una novela y 2 ensayos. Bueno, no quiero robarle más tiempo. Gracias por atenderme.
No me roba nada. Seguimos hablando de despacho.
Necesitaría ir al baño.
Sí, la primera puerta.
Gracias.
So, early in Pedro Almodóvar's 1995 film, La Flor de mi Secreto, we see a meeting, right? Apologies for the audio quality. We see a meeting between a novelist and an El País editor about a possible opinion column. So, if I don't know if everyone understood, but essentially, the woman is a writer. She hasn't published anything, let alone an opinion column, and she's asking to publish, and then she presents a novel and a few essays, right, to this unwitting editor who is caught a little bit off guard at El País. Okay, so just a few scenes later, the editor gives the writer a job as a books columnist for the newspaper's weekend literary supplement. Her first assignment is to review the latest short story collection from a famous author of romance novels, an assignment that she gets in part as a result of her open contempt for this romance writer. The editor, who himself is a fan of this romance novelist, assigns himself a positive review of the very same collection, which will appear alongside the negative review by the newly hired El País columnist. Soon comes the twist. The amateur writer who landed the gig as a columnist is in fact the pseudonymous romance author whose book she is supposed to review. So this twist throws into relief the film's many ironic criticisms of newspaper columnists and novelist intellectuals. In 1990s Spain, the film seems to argue, newspaper columns are a dime a dozen. Any amateur writer with a personal connection to an editor can get one. Moreover, columns in the Sunday pages function as cultural gatekeepers, allowing a high-minded newspaper like El País to decide which artifacts of popular culture deserve its stamp of approval. Not only that, Nepotism is rampant in the clubby world of newspapers. So rampant, in fact, that writers are even allowed to review their own books. And to cap it all off, shady editorial decisions often hide behind an outward appearance of balance, where each side of an issue receives equal column space, right? Literally, in this case, of the short story collection, which will receive exactly one positive and one negative review. Once you see how the sausage is made, this apparent balance looks more and more like a charade. A decade later, Almodóvar's criticisms would be more relevant than ever. In a 2005 column for El País, the writer Elvira Lindo diagnosed, and as an opinion columnist self-diagnosed, a condition that increasingly afflicted the Spanish public sphere: opinionismo, or opinionism. Every morning, she wrote, thousands of professional opinion makers go to work knowing that, quote, they have to come with a well-formed opinion. They must defend it vehemently, and they must draw blood from those who don't think the same way, end quote. Whether these opinionators actually had any expertise, knowledge, or worthwhile opinions on the topics of the day, she noted, was beside the point. They were required to have opinions all the same. Whether that pressure came from the public sphere, in which having a forceful opinion was, quote, interpreted as, in which not having a forceful opinion was interpreted as not wanting to take sides or just being an idiot, this is Elvira Navarro, end quote, or whether that pressure came from a desire to keep one of the few precarious jobs in the opinion-making industry. Today, opinion-making appears to have been democratized. Quote, the great cancer of journalism in Spain is to have overvalued columnists, including myself, the columnist Quique Peinado said in a rabble-rousing interview in 2017. The cell of origin for that cancer was a 21st century culture of precarious work that had conditioned journalists and writers to produce opinion columns on demand. Perhaps because of this, others proclaimed that the opinion columnist as a figure of intellectual prestige was all but dead. Yet such reports of death are often greatly exaggerated. As the historian and opinion columnist Santos Julia noted in 2014, the intellectual has not died, but rather has been democratized, end quote. To become an intellectual in Spain, one no longer needed one of the precious few columnist jobs at El País, El Mundo, ABC, or any one of the many Spanish national newspapers. But one still likely needed an opinion column. The op-ed's durability as a genre of opinion writing is indeed puzzling. Why do we still have op-eds today? Despite fears that an array of new short-form writing on the internet would spell an end to the op-ed, the opposite seems to have happened. Blog posts and Twitter threads, or X threads, have morphed into think pieces, each of which argues its own hot take on current affairs. Make no mistake, this is the language of opinion journalism dressed up for 21st century internet culture. If forms of internet writing had become universal and generalized, as many had assumed, there would be no need to convert these arguments into an op-ed form. But op-eds are still the universal medium or universal currency of opinion writing. The genre's capaciousness to translate ideas that were initially published on Twitter or Facebook or wherever, delivered as TED Talks or Job Talks, written for peer-reviewed journals or the kinds of journals that you keep in your desk drawer, the op-ed remains unparalleled, even today, as a medium of communicating opinion. Although the New York Times decided to retire its use of the term op-ed in 2021, some 5 decades after popularizing it, the form of opinion journalism the term came to represent will likely endure for decades to come. Thank you very much.
¿Alguien tiene alguna pregunta para nuestro invitado?
¿En inglés o en español?
En inglés o en español. Oh, I'm sorry. Questions, please? Opinions? op-eds. No?
Oh, sure. We can. Yeah, let's switch. Yeah. It's all right.
Question?
A question
Sure.
about where are we today? Do you have any idea of the figures of male to female ratio of opinion writers in both newspapers?
I don't have one for the Times. In Spain, there are, I want to say, almost yearly reports on the gender balance in opinion writing. It's pretty. It's become a pretty important topic for certain, let's say, journalistic associations in Spain, and the parity is much better. I think across, the most recent one that I found, I think, was 2023, perhaps, and I think it was something like 43% are female, 43% of women, or of the columnists are women. Yeah, and so I believe that, but it's been getting much better. I think there was essentially a turn in the mid-2000s, the mid-first decade of the 21st century, where all of a sudden, and this is especially, I think it coincided with the explosion of digital newspapers, right? So there was an important newspaper founded in 2007, I believe, Público, right? Which was a print newspaper, but also online newspaper, and that really accelerated the kind of establishment of some kind of statistic that would be closer to parity. Yeah. So I wanted to show, as I mentioned at the beginning of the talk, right, how you have to scroll through. This is scrolling, right? But you can get a sense, right, of how, of where the opinion section is, right? So can I, whoop. Yep. There's international section, and there you go. There's opinion, right? And so this is, I think, basically a standard kind of setup, right? But this actually is a little further down. They put him in, there we go. They put him in the national section in this particular randomly chosen day. I think this is from August 2023, completely random. But you can get a sense of how opinion is organized into just 4 pages. Here they have Anatomía de Twitter, right? An interesting kind of feature that they did for a while, and I think they've completely stopped. But yeah. Other questions?
Muchas gracias. ¿Se me oye?
Sí.
Quiero aprovechar que has mostrado precisamente las páginas principales de opinión del País para preguntarte por en qué medida el mundo literario, no solo los propios así llamados literatos y sobre todo novelistas, sobre todo, sino más bien el mundo literario, incluido el mundo académico, se acaba infiltrando, y uso el verbo con cierta intención, en los propios editoriales del País. Quiero decir, has contrapuesto, lógicamente, el editorial, a lo que está enfrente, ¿no? Op-ed. Pero concretamente en el caso del País, aunque no solo, concretamente en el País, es sabido, porque además abajo aparece
aquí abajo.
Los cargos directivos. En diferentes momentos recientemente ha figurado en la dirección del País alguna persona que está muy destacada en el mundo, sobre todo académico, de los estudios literarios. Y a veces no es difícil rastrear, incluso de forma estilística, la presencia, la huella de críticos literarios que además evidentemente publican en Babelia, la huella de estos críticos y académicos, catedráticos, en los propios editoriales del País. Quiero decir, la relación, me atrevo a decir, tú eres el experto, entre el editorial y lo que está enfrente del editorial es incluso más, si se me permite, más incestuosa, al menos en algunos momentos.
Sí.
Y podría dar nombres, pero creo que no hace falta. Algunos han pasado por el equipo directivo, lo han dejado inmediatamente, pero algunos amigos suyos, algunos estrictamente novelistas, aunque también con cargo universitario, siguen publicando tanto dentro del País como en el suplemento literario, como en el dominical.
Claro.
Estos son ejemplos anecdóticos, pero me temo que tú me dirás que la relación, insisto, es bastante más incestuosa.
Estoy totalmente de acuerdo. Ahora, yo no veo, o bueno, tú me podrás decir, yo no veo muchos escritores, académicos sí, pero escritores, gente del mundo puramente de la literatura, no veo que se haya infiltrado, digamos, en los equipos directivos, ¿no? Porque esos equipos directivos, es que son periodistas de sangre, ¿no? Aún una periodista como Rosa Montero, ¿no? Es, primero, antes que nada, es periodista, ¿no? Era reportera durante muchos años y luego empezó a escribir novelas, ¿no? Pero sí que hay académicos, ¿no? Y especialmente en la sección de opinión, ¿no? Yo diría que... Estoy pensando, a ver... lo siento, no me acuerdo quién es el director de opinión hoy día, pero los últimos dos, antes del presente director, eran académicos, ¿no? Mariam Martínez Bascuñán, profesora, y José Ignacio Torreblanca, profesor, o tenían cargos académicos, ¿no? Y entonces me parece que ahí se ve el peso o el peso de ciertos sectores de la academia, ¿no? en la parte de la sección de opinión, ¿no? Y especialmente son politólogos, ¿no? Y entonces pareciera que hubiera una relación bastante obvia, ¿no? Entre el profesorado de politología en España y las secciones de opinión. Pero en literatura yo sí que veo muchos columnistas, ¿no? Gente que escribe muy a menudo, ¿no? Tanto para el País semanal, Babelia, y también para la sección de opinión, pero los veo más como, de nuevo, tú me dirás, pero yo los veo más como lo que se llamaría weekly columnists a veces, o regular columnists, ¿no? Gente que contribuye con mucha frecuencia, pero que tal vez no tiene un ritmo marcado, ¿no? Pero sí, obviamente, sí hay mucha...
Sí, para despejar dudas, no quiero entrar en argumentos ad hominem, pero el ejemplo más conocido y reconocido reciente para hablar de, como he dicho, el mundo literario, he usado la expresión a propósito, es un académico que está en filología, me refería a Jordi Gracia.
Claro.
Cuyo estilo es muy marcado
claro.
Y que además cabe rastrear, evidentemente esto habría que demostrarlo, como digo, mi opinión es muy anecdótica, en diferentes lugares del país, no solo en Babelia, evidentemente en la parte de cultura, pero incluso, porque ocupó un cargo, ya no, en lugares que no son de opinión, sino más bien de el propio editorial. A eso me refería, con la infiltración, ¿no? Y dejo ya.
Es una cita excelente, ¿no? Porque Jordi Gracia ocupó el cargo de subdirector de opinión del País, ¿no? Que sería más o menos la mano derecha del editor o la editora de opinión, ¿no? Y entonces, pero claro, Manuel Cruz, otros académicos que también han tenido mucha influencia en la política, ¿no? Jordi no sé cuánta influencia ha tenido en la política, pero Manuel Cruz también ha tenido muchísima, ¿no? Y entonces me parece que ahí se pueden ver los vínculos, ¿no? También me hace pensar en en algo que me parece muy despectivo, que se dice del País, ¿no? Que es que el País es un cabal de la inteligencia barcelonesa, ¿no? Catalana, ¿no? Que se ha infiltrado ahí con Jordi Gracia, Jordi Amat, Xavier Vidal-Folch, ¿no? Etcétera, etcétera, ¿no? Claro, claro. Pero no, obviamente, pero claro, es que hay estas percepciones y marcan mucho lo que se publica, ¿no? Y quién manda textos, tribunas, etcétera. Y entonces está muy marcado desde el principio, ¿no? Totalmente. A ti.
¿Una pregunta o intervención más?
Sí. Más preguntas. Sí. Of course.
Thanks. Bécquer, I know that the book itself might address the question I'm about to ask, or does address the question I'm about to ask, but I'm wondering if you could say a little bit more about the sort of way in which this relationship between literature and the op-ed moves in the opposite direction. So, you talked about, for instance, the degree to which the presence of these literary writers provides the newspaper, and particularly its op-ed, with a particular kind of sheen of prestige, right? And I know that the book itself sort of goes into close readings and demonstrates exactly how some of this genre is reflected in the form, the structure of certain narratives. But literature as an institution, what does this sort of symbiosis suggest about literature as an institution, as it's practiced, as it's evolved within Spain since the 1970s? Is it might this sort of give us some kind of insight also into the opposite direction, how this sort of confluence of these two have shaped the way that institution has evolved?
That's a very good question. I think one could say that through its relationship to newspapers, literature, there are particular literary writers, but also kind of, let's say, the literary establishment more generally in Spain has had a greater and more direct access to certain forms of institutional power, right? You can see this very clearly with the Instituto Cervantes, right? Antonio Muñoz Molina, right, was the director of the Instituto Cervantes. Currently, Luis García Montero, a poet, is the director of the Instituto Cervantes. I am not sure that would have happened had these particular writers not had their relationship to certain newspapers. I think that it has helped people in particular, but it's also helped the literary world more generally in certain cultural institutions. That's what I'm trying to think. Do you have anything, do you want to flesh out some more ideas about that question? Because that's, I don't know.
Absolutely not.
Okay. But I would say it's an institutional power that I'm not sure would have reached that high a pinnacle otherwise. Why? Because we see that this doesn't happen in other countries, right?
Yeah.
In the United States, literary writers have some kind of fame, but there's no literary writers that are this famous or this well known in the public sphere, because they don't often. I named two, but they don't even have a regular opinion column at the Times, right? And so, or you can even compare this to the UK is maybe not a great example, but France. Right? In France, literary writers are very well known, very celebrated, but only a few have a direct relationship to even places like Le Monde, right? Yeah. And therefore, their cultural prestige is different, and it's circumscribed in a way that in Spain it's really not. It's much more, let's say, a broader cultural prestige than just someone who is a literary writer. Daniel has a comment.
Ya que hablas de otros países, ¿en qué medida se explica la presencia en prensa extranjera con respecto a España, la presencia de opinión política por parte de escritores literarios? Ejemplos.
Sí.
Javier Cercas en Italia, Javier Marías en Estados Unidos. Sí. Javier Cercas en Estados Unidos. El New York Times, en la época del Procés, publicó muchos artículos de Cercas. Bueno, unos cuantos. Y no solo en Estados Unidos. Javier Marías publicó casi inmediatamente un artículo muy sonado después de los atentados, inmediatamente después de los atentados en Madrid, sobre todo. Juan Goytisolo en su época también tenía cierta presencia en la prensa francesa y, en general, para dar su opinión sobre temas políticos, siendo como eran y son, en ciertos ámbitos, al menos en Italia, en Estados Unidos hasta cierto punto, y en Francia, conocidos sobre todo como literatos. Entonces, quiero decir, se proyecta no sé cómo llamarlo, si problema o fenómeno, se proyecta al extranjero. Quiero decir, hay periódicos como La República, como Le Monde, como New York Times, que piden la opinión de literatos para hablar de política española.
Yo diría que, yo diría que eso refleja más
Me callo.
la posición como intelectuales de estos autores dentro de España, más que lo que proyectan en otros países, ¿no? Y entonces Javier Cercas, sí, publicó unos cuantos op-eds, ¿no?, en el New York Times, y eso lo hizo, estoy casi seguro, lo hizo porque tenía una columna en El País, donde estaba publicando cada semana, ¿no?, sobre Cataluña, ¿no? Y entonces el New York Times, si tú eres un editor del New York Times, ojeas El País, ojeas los grandes periódicos de estos países y ves, ah, mira, bueno, y no te complica la vida que es un escritor, ¿no? Porque si a él se le trata así, de esta manera, en este otro país, entonces, it's good enough, ¿no? Pero los mismos editores no harían lo mismo con los novelistas americanos. Y eso es lo curioso, ¿no? Y me parece que es, de nuevo, por la relación estrecha que tienen dentro de España, ¿no?, con el mundo de los periódicos dentro de España, porque fuera Javier Marías, sí, una tribunita, pero no les piden más, ¿no?, salvo en estos momentos determinados, y de nuevo es porque están ya publicando en El País, ¿no? Sí.
Muchísimas gracias por...
Un momentito.
Ok, gracias. Bueno, pues empiezo de nuevo. Muchas gracias por su conferencia. Está repleta de sugerencias y de reflexiones y de hilos de los que tirar. Estaba pensando, escuchándole, ha hecho un recorrido histórico prácticamente por la cabecera del País, y en algunos casos, como usted muestra, hay contribuciones, digamos, casi permanentes, ¿no?, como la de Rosa Montero. Y me preguntaba, con los cambios de inversores y con los cambios que ha tenido el país, como muchos otros medios, ¿cómo se explica? Tengo dos preguntas. ¿Cómo se explica la permanencia de algunas firmas de manera recurrente, y si afecta esos cambios de inversión, de grupos de poder detrás? No sé muy bien cómo nombrarlo, sin referirme así de manera rápida al dinero, ¿no? Cómo esa inversión ha condicionado la participación o no de algunas de estas firmas. Me remito a las que usted ha señalado, que tienen que ver con literatos y demás. Sí. Y luego un pequeño apunte que me hacía pensar esta última reflexión que ha cruzado usted con Daniel Aguirre, y que tiene que ver con esta réplica a veces, ¿no?, de algunas firmas en periódicos internacionales. Bueno, creo que tiene también bastante que ver la presencia de esos nombres en The New York Times, pero también en The Guardian o en Le Monde, porque estos periódicos están en una alianza común de periódicos internacionales, y a veces intercambian colaboraciones, intercambian firmas, o a veces lo que se publica es meramente una traducción del artículo también, que ha aparecido primero en castellano y que de manera inminente o rápida aparece también en inglés. No sé tampoco del tema, pero no estoy del todo segura si es una solicitud rápida de una colaboración o simplemente un intercambio de firmas, de alianzas de prensa que funcionan ahora como tal, ¿no?
Sí. Muy buenas preguntas. Así que la segunda, a veces son traducciones y a veces no. Todo depende, ¿no? Porque también en la prensa norteamericana, salvo que seas lo que se llama un syndicated columnist, ¿no?, es decir, un columnista donde venden los derechos de tu columna a varios periódicos, exactamente, salvo no les gusta traducir columnas, ¿no? Si tú ves ahora de nuevo, yo solo puedo leer, yo no estoy dentro de la redacción, yo solo puedo leer lo que me ponen aquí en el periódico, ¿no? Y entonces tal vez puede que estén traducidas, pero que no se explicita, ¿no? Que no se dice, ¿no? Pero tengo la impresión de que a los editores no les gusta algo más fresco, ¿no? Puede ser fresco en lo escrito, ¿no? Las ideas pueden ser refritas, todo lo que tú quieras, pero fresco en lo escrito. Y entonces me imagino que una persona como Javier Cercas, pues escribe la columna en inglés, trabaja con un editor, se lo traduce ahí, pero como que no publica la versión en español para que sea... No lo sé, bueno, Daniel sabrá.
Hay un caso notorio
sí.
de Javier Marías con motivo de los atentados,
sí.
porque era la víspera de las elecciones, no se conocía la autoría, estaba la versión del gobierno de Aznar con ETA,
claro.
Y si uno compara el original de Marías en la prensa española con la traducción en el New York Times, es fascinante los cambios que hay.
Ah, mira.
Eso lo estudiamos en el departamento, por eso lo digo, los estudiantes están encantados de ver lo que hace el New York Times con artículos publicados en otra lengua, y me callo.
Sí, así, pues genial. No, es un caso interesante. No, pero bueno, no sé, el New York Times no da publicidad, entonces, quién sabe. En el caso económico, es una buena pregunta. A mí no se me ocurre ningún caso en el que un inversor haya dicho, este columnista literario, no, fuera, ¿no? Ahora, eso puede ser por varios motivos. Me parece que, en general, es porque los columnistas como que no se arriesgan o solo en escasas ocasiones se han arriesgado a hablar sobre economía, ¿no? El caso famoso, de hecho, es Muñoz Molina, ¿no? Que escribió mucho sobre la crisis económica, y mucha gente, muchos economistas y politólogos y otros, decían que no sabía lo que decía, ¿no? Y luego escribió todo un libro, ¿no? Haciendo eco en el título a Marx, ¿no? Donde sus ideas económicas, como que su moral, vale, te lo compro, pero las ideas económicas no explicaban muy bien por qué estaba pasando esta crisis económica, ¿no? Pero los casos en que sí se han despedido columnistas es por criticar la redacción, ¿no? Del periódico. No hubo el caso famoso en el 2000, ¿cuándo fue? 2016, 17, cuando un columnista entrevistado por el reportero del Times en España, cuyo nombre se me escapa ahora, y publicó en el New York Times en inglés esta entrevista donde él pues criticaba el País por no decirle de antemano cuando iban a publicar su columna o no sé qué, y entonces al día siguiente, a las semanas después le dijeron pues no tienes columna. Pero entonces son cosas muy determinadas, y eso me parece que fue como un ejercicio político por parte de ese grupo, ¿no? De editores que, pues yo qué sé, tenían una manía con un escritor particular, un columnista en particular, pero no era un columnista literato, y era además una situación muy determinada, ¿no? De autocrítica al periódico, ¿no? Pero sí, me parece que en general no amenazan el poder de los inversores, ¿no? Y yo diría no solo los literatos, muchos columnistas no pretenden amenazar y no amenazan ese poder, ¿no? Pero esa es mi impresión, no sé. No, a ti. Sí.
Estupendo, pues muchas gracias.
Oh.
Diríamos que
uno más, venga.
Una última intervención, entonces. Sí.
This event was advertised as being in English, so I'll speak English
Sure.
because there might be people who don't know Spanish.
Of course.
Thinking in these terms. First of all, something very personal. I hope you don't mind.
Not at all.
Your parents must loved Spanish romantic poets.
My father.
Okay. Because I assume Bécquer is your first name.
Indeed.
Okay.
¿Te gusta Adolfo? But I'm not from Sevilla. I'm not from
Okay.
Sevilla.
Secondly, have you published anything in the New York Times or the El País?
Oh boy, here we go. I have not published anything in the New York Times. I typically write in English for The Nation magazine, but I have published in El País. I published for no, not in no, not here. No, to get into here, you need to know people.
That's what I figured.
No. I published in Babelia, which is edited by Jordi Amat, and I published a piece. When was it? In early February, on the novelist Almudena Grandes. Yeah, and so I have a connection to a certain part of El País. But the weird thing about El País is that it seems very, to me, again from the outside, it seems very kind of separated, right? I can clearly understand right now, having collaborated once, why there seems to be such a brick wall between the opinion section and a magazine like Babelia, which is a weekly kind of cultural supplement, or El País Semanal, right? And many of the major literary writers in Spain who have published columns in El País actually begin with one of the cultural supplements, primarily with El País Semanal, and then maybe they get a column in Opinion. But there's no real connection.
Do you know if El País Internacional still exists?
Oh gosh.
Or do you know, have you heard of it?
Yes, of course. So I believe, so El País publishes editions in Latin America. They publish an English edition, and I believe El País Internacional was turned into the English, or I think it, or it was maybe shuffled into the Latin American editions. I don't think there is like the New York Times, the International Herald Tribune, right? I don't think that that exists anymore. They just kind of publish the New York Times and then ship it wherever, right? And I think El País doesn't do that anymore, but I could be wrong. I've never.
In the early '80s, I used to receive it. You know, it was very thin paper, and
Sure.
it was weekly. It wasn't daily.
Right.
You know, and but I enjoyed it. You know, receiving it here. You know, in those days, we didn't have what we have today. You know, so it was a great way to get all these this information from Spain. You know, yeah. Is it easy for you to go to your very first slide?
Oh.
And I believe
Sure.
there is a mistake on a date.
Oh, oops.
And so that way you could correct if I hope
No.
I hope I'm not mistaken.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I'll look at it. I can't do it right now, but I'll look at it. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor
Thank you.
Seguín. Yeah.
Gracias.
Thank you. So thank you very much. Muchísimas gracias.
Yeah.
Ha sido interesantísimo y las preguntas y respuestas han sido maravillosas. Así que podemos pasar a seguir charlando uno a uno y con una copa de vino en medio, porque ahora damos vino, por eso veo que viene tanta gente últimamente. Así que, por favor, adelante, sírvanse y charlen con Bécquer todo lo que ustedes quieran.
Gracias.